Hey guys, tonight we drift back into a world where the Aegean is not just a body of water, but the very bloodstream of a restless civilization. Imagine moonlight falling over whitewashed stone fishing boats, pulled up on the beach, and voices carrying across the water like distant flutes. Now picture an ancient sailor's trembling hand pressing a stylus into wax marking a dot, a tiny island where none should be. That little scratch, that moment of hesitation becomes the beginning of one of history's strangest riddles. And yes, if you tried rowing across the Mediterranean with nothing but an amphora of wine for comfort, you probably wouldn't survive the trip though, at least you'd go down hydrated. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And since I love knowing who's listening, and post your location and your local time down below. Now find yourself a cozy seat or a soft bed. Let your mind begin to unwind, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins with the Greek sailors, who long before Rome flexed its muscles, roamed the sea like nervous cats with endless curiosity. Their ships were lean, stitched together with flax and tar, propelled by men whose backs grew into ropes after years of rowing. These sailors charted islands like beads on a necklace Samos, Lesbos, Chios roads, each a name that rang with myth and trade. But in one old record just beyond the familiar Cyclades, a new island is etched. Its name is faded half-syllables left like crumbs on a table, yet its presence is undeniable, a solitary crescent drawn once and never again. Mainstream fact steadies us here. The Greeks really did produce maps, though not in the paper atlas style we picture today. Their charts often lived as sketches on wax tablets, or as verbal instructions woven into poems. The epic journeys of Homer, for instance, contain geographic hints that double as sailing directions. The geographer Anaximander is credited with making one of the earliest maps of the known world in the 6th century BCE, and Herodotus later wrote accounts laced with distances and bearings. Yet between those sober efforts lived countless little drawings, half report, half daydream, where unknown lands slipped in like uninvited dinner guests. The quirky side of this tale emerges quickly. Some say the island was first noted by fishermen chasing tuna men who had rowed farther west than usual after a stubborn shoal. They returned with eyes glazed by exhaustion, swearing they had glimpsed a coastline covered in forests. Others insisted it was sighted during a religious voyage, when priests carrying sacred fire to a distant sanctuary lost their way in fog. According to one amusing fragment, they landed, sacrificed a goat, and discovered the ground itself shook, after which the island sank back into the sea before dawn. True or not, the story circulated widely enough that scribes felt compelled to draw it down. Historians still argue whether such a mark was anything more than rumour. Was it a volcanic outcrop that briefly appeared like the islands that occasionally rise near Santorini after underwater eruptions? Was it a mirage? A fata morgana where light bent on humid evenings conjured the outline of phantom cliffs? Or was it simply wishful thinking, sailors' eyes stitching land out of shadow, because no one wants to admit the horizon is empty? Each theory carries its own allure, and each leaves the mystery dangling just enough to keep listeners leaning forward. Picture the scribe himself, perhaps seated in a dimly lit chamber, beeswax candles sputtering as he copies a sea chart for a naval commander. His hand wavers as he adds the faintest of lines, a crescent shape adrift west of Delos. He scratches a note in the margin reported by sailors and then moves on, not realizing he has planted a seed that future generations will puzzle over. That scratch of ink is how the island first breathes into history, tentative, half-believed, but real enough to live on parchment. The Greeks had a peculiar habit of blurring geography and mythology, so the island soon drew more than practical interest. Poets hinted it might be the hiding place of sea nymphs, while traders whispered of untouched forests perfect for shipbuilding. Priests never missing a chance to turn mystery into message suggested the gods had dropped the island into the sea, as a reminder that mortals should not grow too certain of their maps. Even comedians got involved, one playwright joking that the island was where lazy husbands disappeared when they claimed to be fishing. Laughter has a way of making stories stick, and so the Phantom Island slipped deeper into cultural memory. By the time mariners returned to their ports with new tales, sometimes insisting they saw the land again, sometimes swearing it had vanished, the mark had already acquired its aura. Maps copied and recopied preserved the faint crescent. Children staring at charts in dusty schools learned to ask, "What is this place?" And their teachers, unwilling to say "we don't know," would spin answers, a gift of Poseidon, a test of bravery, a shore glimpsed only by the pure of heart. Whether those answers soothed or inflamed curiosity depended on the listener, but the mystery never cooled. The Lost Island thus enters history not with a discovery, not with a conquest, but with hesitation, the kind of hesitation that lingers in ink, refusing to be scrubbed away. From that moment, Greece carries a ghost on its maps. A ghost no one can quite catch, but no one dares to erase. And tonight, as we begin this journey together, you'll find that this ghostly coastline will keep slipping in and out of our tale, like a tide that never rests. The story drifts outward from the harbours of Greece, where ships lean into the wind and their sails snap with the energy of restless ambition. Greek sailors from the bustling port of Piraeus to the rocky coves of Ionia are raised with salt in their lungs and rope calluses on their palms. They live by the rhythm of oars striking water and the creak of timbers that know too many storms. For them the horizon is not simply a line, it is a promise, an invitation, and sometimes a taunt. Out there beyond the Cyclades, past the dark shoulders of Crete, and farther west where the Aegean breathes into the Ionian whispers of a lost island begin to spread. No one can quite say who first charted it, or even whether it was charted at all, but maps and stories acquire weight when repeated in taverns, temples and markets. The Lost Island begins to loom as a kind of half-believed certainty, a rumour that sailors can neither prove nor abandon. Life on these ships is never glamorous, despite the romantic images carved into amphorae. Sailors eat hard-bread onions and whatever fish they can drag over the side on a line. Rats, always industrious freeloaders, gnaw at sacks of grain. At night, men curl up on the deck under the stiff smell of tar rocking with the sea and hoping the timbers don't groan too loudly. And yet they laugh, swap dirty jokes and argue about who snores loudest. When one among them swears, he glimpsed a shoreline rising faintly in the distance. The laughter turns sharp. The others jostle him with mock punches, but a part of every man aboard wonders silently whether he too has ever seen something shimmering at the edge of a reason. The Greeks are not strangers to strange lands. Mainstream history assures us that by the 8th century BCE they are trading and colonizing across the Mediterranean, planting colonies in Sicily, southern Italy, and along the Black Sea. Their ships, mostly triremes and merchant vessels, hug coastlines whenever possible, yet courage sometimes forces them farther into the open. They bring back tales of tin from far-off Britain, amber trickling down trade routes from the Baltic, and spices whose origins no one can quite explain. In such a culture of restless expansion, the notion of a lost island fits neatly another prize to chase another excuse to push the prow into deeper seas. But sailors are poets in their own way. A helmsman might say the sea breathes that waves inhale and exhale under the moonlight. A deckhand peering into mist mutters that fog has moods, that it can play tricks like a mischievous child. When one ship returns to port, battered by storms, its captain insists they nearly ran aground on an island covered in green hills. He describes goats skipping across ridges and trees bent by the wind. Yet when questioned more carefully, his memory blurs. Were the goats real, or imagined through a spray of salt water and exhaustion? Historians still argue whether such accounts were genuine eyewitness memories distorted by hardship, or deliberate fabrications told to impress patrons and secure more funding. One quirky anecdote emerges from a fragment of a comic playwright. He describes a sailor staggering home and declaring to his wife that he had found an island made entirely of wine jugs, each one refilling itself as soon as it was drained. The crowd roared with laughter, but behind the satire is a recognisable truth sailors embellish. They know their audiences crave marvels, so even a half-seen silhouette of land can swell into a tale worth retelling. And if an island truly did shimmer once on the horizon before vanishing into fog, who can resist adding a few vineyards or golden beaches for flavour? Navigation itself in these centuries is half art, half prayer. Without compasses, sailors rely on the sun by day, the stars by night, and the instincts born from endless practice. They watch seabirds, dolphins, and drifting wood, guessing at the nearness of land. Sometimes these signs lead them safely to shore. Other times they trick them into chasing phantoms. A flock of birds can appear far offshore if wind currents carry them, and cloud banks at dusk often mimic mountains. These natural illusions might account for some of the sightings, but in a world where gods meddle in daily affairs, divine illusions feel just as plausible as earthly ones. Picture a crew straining at their oars, sweat dripping down their backs as the sun bleeds into the sea. The lookout perched high on a mast shouts that he sees something dark ridges against the dying light. The men cheer, spirits lifting with sudden hope. They dream of fresh water shade, perhaps even a friendly harbour. But by dawn the horizon is clean, washed blank by the sun's ruthless clarity. Their cheers curdle into curses. Their strength leaks into silence, and yet the memory of that glimpse remains. An island glimpsed and lost is somehow more powerful than land solidly reached, because it plants a question in the mind: what if it was real, and what if they turned away too soon? Scholars later copying old maps inherit the puzzle. They ink faint coastlines with hesitant strokes marking notes like seen by mariners or reported once. The lost island becomes not just a sailor's tale but a scholar's dilemma. Erase it, and you risk erasing something real. Keep it, and you preserve a ghost. One can almost imagine the scholars sighing, dipping quills into ink and muttering to themselves, better a phantom coastline than no coastline at all. Back in the harbours, the story feeds tavern talk. Merchants calculate how many amphorae of oil or sacks of barley could be sold if such a land were reached. Poets polish the tale into allegory, claiming the island symbolises love, ambition, or fleeting youth. Children hearing their parents argue about politics imagine the island as a place where adults stop shouting and start smiling. The lost island becomes a mirror in which each person sees what they wish, and so the legend expands. A fisherman insists he smelled pine resin far from shore. Another swears he heard dogs barking across the water. A weary oarsman claims he saw smoke rising from hills that vanished when the wind shifted. These details blur fact and fancy, but they weave a net that holds attention. The more uncertain the story becomes, the more people seem to cherish it. The island, elusive and frustrating, is also irresistible. The sailors who carried the rumour of the Phantom Island westward were not poets, and they were certainly not professional myth-makers. They were practical men who spent most of their days worrying about leeks, rats, and whether the cook's stew had been sitting out too long in the sun. Yet even these salt-crusted mariners could not resist the allure of a coastline that shimmered on the horizon and then dissolved like breath on glass. Each time the tale passed from ship to shore, it grew a little larger, acquiring details that did not survive the spray of the sea but thrived in the smoke of taverns. One captain swore he saw hills rising in green tiers, while another insisted the land rang with the cries of birds unlike any he had ever heard. Their words tangled together, forming the first fragile web of memory around a place that might never have been real. What makes this moment so intriguing is how quickly the Phantom Isle slipped into cultural shorthand. In Athens, orators with a flair for drama began comparing untrustworthy promises to that horizon which hides the wandering island. It became the kind of metaphor you might hear in the agora when someone was selling olives at a suspiciously good price. Quirky as it sounds, this island was already doing double duty. It was at once a possible discovery and a convenient punchline. Historians still argue whether the sailors truly believed what they saw, or whether they simply enjoyed the status of having glimpsed a secret world. After all, the ancient Greeks valued tales of adventure almost as much as they valued amphorae of wine, and this story supplied both. Mainstream fact helps anchor this moment. The Greeks of the archaic and classical periods were skilled mariners who explored far beyond their familiar coasts. They reached as far as the Black Sea and the Western Mediterranean, leaving colonies like Massalia, modern Marseille, as evidence of their reach. They also charted parts of the Atlantic beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the strait we call Gibraltar. These ventures demonstrate that Greek sailors were indeed pushing into regions where strange atmospheric effects, mirages or volcanic islands, could have created fleeting illusions of land. When one considers how often seafarers relied on star positions, coastal landmarks, and little else, the possibility of a mirage transforming into a full-blown myth no longer feels far-fetched. In the taverns of Piraeus, the great port of Athens, the story took on a theatrical life of its own. Imagine a group of sailors hunched around low wooden tables, their tunics damp, their sandals shedding sand on the floor. One slams down his cup and declares, "I tell you it was there, a whole forest waving in the wind." Another shakes his head solemnly and insists he saw smoke rising like incense from a temple hidden among cliffs. A third already, several cups deep, claims the island spoke to him in thunderous words, though when pressed to repeat them he can only burp and grin. By the end of the night, the listeners, merchants, farmers and hangers-on, were less concerned about truth than about the thrill of imagining the impossible. This communal storytelling helped cement the island into Greek imagination. Just as they had woven tales about Atlantis, or about Odysseus wandering among sorceresses and one-eyed giants, they now had a fresh mystery to toy with. Unlike Atlantis, however, this island was not burdened with the heavy philosophical lessons of Plato. It was lighter, looser, more like a rumour that could be bent to suit whatever moral joke or warning a speaker desired. The fact that no one could ever agree on its exact location only made it more appealing. It hovered like a moving target available for endless interpretation. One curious anecdote from a later chronicler describes a merchant who wagered his fortune on ships sent west to find the Phantom Isle. He promised investors a land overflowing with timber and grain. When the vessels returned empty, he was mocked in the Agora as the governor of nowhere. The nickname stuck for months, providing comic relief to a city that often needed it. Yet the joke carried a sting the very act of investing showed, that even hard-headed men of commerce could be seduced by the dream of a land that danced at the horizon. Quirky, yes, but believable in a society that always straddled the line between myth and pragmatism. The debate over the island even filtered into Greek plays and poems. In one satirical fragment, a chorus mocks a politician by comparing him to the Phantom Isle, visible only when convenient, gone the moment responsibility approached. In another, a lyric poet likens longing for a lost lover to sailing endlessly toward that elusive coastline. These cultural echoes prove how swiftly the island left the docks and entered the bloodstream of Greek imagination. Historians still argue whether the Phantom Island was a genuine navigational note carried across generations, or simply a metaphor that later antiquity mistakenly treated as geography. Either way, the fact remains that it endured in both forms. Meanwhile, practical men tried to reconcile the legend with reality. Some scholars suggested the sailors might have glimpsed Madeira, or the Canary Islands known later to be volcanic, and often veiled in mist. Others speculated that banks of cloud rising like cliffs could play tricks on eyes strained by salt and wind. A few even proposed that floating pumice from distant eruptions might give the illusion of land from afar. These theories remind us that the line between perception and invention is thin, and sailors, like all humans, were reluctant to admit they had been fooled. Better to insist on a miraculous island than to confess to error. As centuries wore on, the tale persisted not because it was proven, but because it was useful. The Phantom Isle became a backdrop against which sailors bragged, poets dreamed, and politicians schemed. Each retelling added fresh colour like layers of paint over a fading fresco, until the original sighting, if any sighting ever occurred, was long obscured. And yet that obscurity was precisely its charm. A real island might disappoint, offering only rocks and goats. A Phantom Island, by contrast, could never fail to impress because it was always exactly as wondrous as the listener wished it to be. By the close of this period, the Phantom Island had secured its place alongside the other, half-real, half-imagined features of the Greek maritime world. It was a ghostly sibling to known archipelagos, a reminder that even the most rational navigators lived in a universe that still left room for the whimsical and the uncanny. And as long as ships left shore, the horizon would remain the stage where rumour and reality played their endless tug-of-war. The Aegean night is thick with salt and the sound of waves slapping against wooden hulls, and the sailors who first sketch the island on their rough charts insist that they are not drunk, not tired, not seeing things. They claim they truly set eyes upon a shadow of land, an outline that rose like a sleeping beast from the horizon, then dissolved back into haze. These are Greek crews hardened by years of rowing and sail work men, who can measure distances by the rhythm of oar strokes, and who joke about storms like they are extended family. And yet, for all their bravado, their voices drop to whispers when they describe the island that cannot be held in view. They speak of forests bending in a wind that did not touch their sails, of beaches that seemed to shimmer and then vanish, and of smoke that curled upward only to scatter like a magician's trick. Anyone listening in a quiet tavern corner would be forgiven for thinking these stories more suited to poets than pilots. Still, the map receives another faint line of coastline, and rumour spreads the way spilled oil glides across water. Mainstream history anchors this drifting narrative with one undeniable truth. Greek sailors of the classical and Hellenistic ages were expert observers of coastlines and weather, but their navigational methods relied heavily on sight. They lacked compasses, depending instead on stars' sun and the shape of familiar mountains. That dependence made them especially vulnerable to illusions at sea. Volcanic haze from islands like Santorini could drift for miles. Cloud banks often imitated land masses, and mirages played tricks on eyes, exhausted from long watches. The sailors who recorded the Phantom Island may have been no more fanciful than anyone today, who swears they saw a figure in the fog only to realise later it was a lamppost. The Mediterranean has always been as much a theatre of perception as of geography. One quirky tidbit slides into the logbooks of later retellings. A chronicler in Alexandria claimed that a crew once tried to sail toward the island, only to find their oars struck a patch of water so thick with floating pumice that it felt like ploughing through porridge. The men, frustrated and superstitious, declared that the gods had built a barrier around the land to keep mortals away. Whether this actually occurred or whether it was another tavern exaggeration is unclear, but the image of boats halted by a sea turned to stone lingers in the imagination. It makes for an excellent fireside anecdote. Remember when the ocean turned into soup, and we almost lost the ship? Sailors, after all, never waste a chance to turn disaster into punchline. Historians still argue whether the phantom island the Greeks reported was a true volcanic birthland briefly thrust above the waves before collapsing back beneath, or whether it was entirely an invention crafted by the fatigue and optimism of crews desperate to discover something new. Volcanic activity in the Mediterranean is well documented. Santorini, Lipari and Stromboli all prove how the Earth can spit up new shapes overnight. A newborn island could easily vanish in months, leaving only memories and conflicting maps. On the other hand, sailors had much to gain by embellishing their stories. A phantom land promised fame, patronage, perhaps even a temple raised in their honour. Which motive weighed heavier, truth or ambition, remains unanswered. The debates are not just confined to later scholars. The Greeks themselves wrestled with them. Some shipmasters mocked the notion of phantom land, declaring that sailors simply mistook clouds for cliffs. Others leaned into the mystery, weaving it into the lore they carried with them like talismans. Imagine a symposium in Athens where over watered wine one sailor swears he glimpsed a mountain rising out of the fog, while a sceptical philosopher strokes his beard and mutters that such talk is merely the sea playing tricks. The laughter of the gathering hides the deeper unease. What if the ocean does hold secrets? What if the gods do raise lands and sink them at will, reminding mortals that no map is permanent? A poet of the period turns the tale into metaphor. He compares the phantom island to a lover glimpsed across a crowded marketplace, seen desired, but always vanishing when approached. His lines are copied on wax tablets and murmured in portside taverns, giving the story a new shape. Now it is not just about geography, but about longing and loss, about desire itself being as treacherous as the waves. Sailors grin when they hear it, amused that their terrifying storm story has been transformed into a romantic parable. Yet the verses spread faster than the logs of any captain. Sometimes poetry preserves what pragmatism cannot. Meanwhile, practical men continue to argue the details. Some insist the island could serve as a valuable station for resupply if only it could be fixed in place. Others warn that its vanishing nature is itself a divine message: chase it if you dare, but you will never hold it. Still others suggest it might be one of the so-called Fortunate Isles, a blessed set of lands described in earlier Greek myth forever drifting at the edge of the known world. The overlapping theories make the phantom island less a single story than a tapestry, woven with threads of ambition, fear, faith and jest. Each sailor, each poet, each philosopher adds his own colour until the truth, if there ever was one, is buried beneath layers of embroidery. The tavern stories acquire embellishments almost by the hour. One man claims he smelled pine resin on the wind, though no forest lay nearby. Another insists he saw birds circling above a spot where no island stood, as if the sky itself remembered a land the sea had erased. These are the kinds of sensory details that make the hair prickle on the necks of listeners, even if they dismiss them afterward. For a people who place trust in omens, signs like these carried a weight far beyond rational debate. And then there is the quiet fear, rarely spoken aloud but always present. What if the island was not lost but hiding? What if it belonged to gods or monsters who preferred to keep mortals away? Greek myth is full of jealous deities and lurking beasts, from Poseidon's rages to the whims of nymphs and sirens. To approach a land that disappeared might be to court their wrath. Some captains mutter that it is better to steer clear better, to bring home a safe cargo of wine and grain, than to tempt whatever powers guard the western horizon. Their caution, however, never erases the itch of curiosity, so the phantom island remains its coastline half-etched, into charts, its name whispered, but never fixed. It is at once a promise and a warning, a riddle that Greek sailors cannot solve, but cannot resist repeating. Each new voyage carries the possibility of sighting it again, and each return without proof leaves the mystery intact. And for the Greeks who valued both exploration and storytelling, perhaps that was the island's greatest gift. It gave them something to argue about, to laugh over, to sing about, and to dream toward. They whisper of the sea as if it were alive, not simply water and salt, but a stage that can conspire with or against human plans. By the time Greek sailors pass beyond the Aegean and nudge into the wider Atlantic currents, they bring not only their oars and sails, but also their habits of storytelling. They have mapped harbours, marked shoals, and charted stars, but when a shape rises from the horizon and then fades before they can measure it, the gap between memory and proof begins to stretch. The Lost Island becomes not only an entry in a pilot's log, but also a character one that appears at will and refuses to be pinned down. Ancient mariners did not have compasses to reassure them. They relied on a network of sightings, landmarks, and wind patterns. When any one of those failed, an entire journey could bend off course. It is in this uncertainty that the mysterious island thrives. Sailors standing at the prow shout that they see treetops shimmering, and the crew hurries to adjust, rigging their fingers raw from rope. Minutes later, mist curls in, and the view evaporates like spilled wine drying on marble. One sailor mutters that Poseidon is playing games. Another insists that the gods would never stoop to such childish tricks, though he keeps a lucky charm tucked under his tunic all the same. Humour has its place at sea. One helmsman claims that the island simply dislikes their ship's paint, and will show itself only to vessels of a different colour. The laughter that follows does not hide their nervous glances at the horizon. Mainstream fact steadies the tension. Greek seafaring depended heavily on recognising seasonal wind systems, and the Etesian winds blowing from the north in summer were vital to travel. Historians still argue whether descriptions of sudden weather shifts around the Phantom Island were natural squalls exaggerated into myth or evidence of unusual local currents. Either explanation could work, but neither reduces the grip of the tale. Sailors' accounts were not merely about survival, they were about feeding the insatiable appetite for stories waiting in ports and marketplaces. Quirky details multiply like barnacles. One tale describes an island where the goats supposedly had golden teeth gleaming whenever dawn struck their jaws. Another insists that the ground itself exhaled warmth, as though fires burned just beneath the soil. Later commentators, perhaps with a wink, suggest volcanic activity might explain such visions, but sailors preferred the drama of beasts and enchanted earth. After all, saying you spotted steam venting from the ground does not earn you free wine in a tavern. Saying you saw golden goats almost certainly will. Scholars far from the waves sharpened their arguments. They examined these accounts and debated whether islands could be born from volcanic eruptions, and then vanish when the sea swallowed them again. The Mediterranean world may not have spoken of tectonic plates, but it knew that the earth cracked, shifted, and belched smoke. The eruption of Thera centuries earlier was proof enough that entire landscapes could be rewritten overnight. If nature had once undone a city, why could it not also conjure a fleeting island only to pull it back beneath the water? The thought was unsettling but plausible enough to linger. Meanwhile, sailors layered superstition upon superstition. They claimed that birds flew toward the island only to veer suddenly away, as if frightened by some unseen presence. Others swore that the sea itself darkened unnaturally around the place, shading from blue to inky black, though sunlight struck every other direction. Such claims are impossible to verify, but they build atmosphere, and atmosphere is what stories need. A quirk of shadow becomes an omen. A moment of silence between waves becomes the voice of gods. Every failed attempt to reach the island only strengthened its legend. Crews returned, battered, claiming storms had pushed them back just as they neared land. Their empty holds did not disprove their tales. Instead, they gave the island a reputation for defending itself. Captains told investors that they had nearly reached its shores only to be thwarted by fate. Investors grumbled, yet the thought of untapped forests or mineral wealth kept them listening. Hope is resilient, and profit always needs a fresh horizon. One particularly strange account tells of a ship whose crew smelled pine resin on the breeze, though no land was visible. They swore that the aroma was so strong it coated their throats as though they were standing in a forest. No other vessel confirmed it, but the anecdote endured repeated whenever sailors gathered with cups of sour wine. It is a detail so oddly specific that it resists dismissal. Perhaps it was drifting wood, perhaps the mind inventing sense to fill a void, or perhaps the lost island really did breathe upon them for an instant. Historians still argue whether sensory fragments like these are proof of real encounters, or nothing more than the exhaustion of men who wanted to believe. Back in port, the story spreads with embellishment. Children draw crude sketches of the island in sand, imagining castles on its cliffs. Merchants speculate that its fields could rival Egypt's for grain. Poets compare its vanishing act to the promises of fickle lovers. In each retelling, the lost island acquires a new shape. It becomes not a single location, but a reflection of every desire, fear and joke that ancient Greeks carried to sea. The persistence of the tale reveals more than geography. It shows a society unable to let mysteries fade quietly. To the Greeks, the horizon itself was a provocation, daring them to keep sailing, keep asking, keep inventing. Even when faced with failure, they clung to possibility. And in that possibility, the Phantom Island thrived, not a mistake to be corrected, but a dream too useful to erase. The rumour of the island survives the turn of generations, but like wine that sits too long in an amphora, it grows stronger, stranger, and sometimes a little sour. Children who once listened wide-eyed to their grandfathers' tales now sit as grey-haired elders themselves, telling the same stories with a few embellishments that never existed before. They insist with the confidence only age can supply that they knew someone who had actually seen the phantom land, an uncle who worked the docks, a cousin who sailed west, a neighbour who brought back a seashell shaped like no shell anyone else had ever seen. Whether or not the shell was real hardly matters. The story clings tighter than truth. Merchants use these tales like a seasoning in their sales pitches. One can almost hear the scene in the marketplace, a seller of olives leaning forward, lowering his voice so customers leaning closer and saying, "These are from the very groves near the Phantom Isle." Of course, the olives are from southern Italy, just like they always are, but attaching the legend adds an invisible sheen of adventure. Shoppers may not believe it, but they like the flavour of the lie. It makes them feel as though in eating something ordinary they nibble at a piece of mystery too. And if the market thrives on exaggeration, taverns thrive on outright performance. Sailors stumble in from long voyages, half drunk, half honest, spinning yarns about storms that seem to have personalities, about waves that herded ships away like shepherd dogs guiding reluctant sheep. One swears he heard laughter on the wind, another insists he saw lights flickering in the mist like torches on distant cliffs. The tavern's patrons laugh, groan and order more wine. Jokes sprout like weeds. Someone claims the island's governor is a fog bank. Another suggests the only export is excuses, and yet another insists Rome taxes it at double rate simply because no one can disprove the figures. Laughter fills the smoky air, but beneath it lingers something heavier, the nagging feeling that the sea is toying with them, that somewhere out there beyond the horizon lies a truth they can neither prove nor dismiss. Mainstream fact does give these stories just enough backbone to stand. Greek sailors had indeed charted islands far into the Atlantic. The Canary Islands were described by Pliny the Elder, who notes their volcanic ridges, their wild dogs and their curious fertility. If islands so far west truly existed and could be reached, then why not another one just a little farther out? That tiny sliver of plausibility is all the rumour needs to survive. Erase it entirely and the tale would vanish like smoke. Leave even a fingernail's worth of evidence and the story digs in with claws. Historians still argue whether any ancient sailor ever glimpsed the Azores, or whether volcanic activity in the region briefly lifted land into sight before it sank again. Some argue for mirages, the bending of light over heated sea air. Others insist sailors simply exaggerated fog banks into forests. The debates carry on not only in modern classrooms, but in Roman libraries of the past, where scholars in indigo robes scowled at maps and muttered that absence is not proof of non-existence. The Phantom Island became less about discovery and more about endurance, a test of how long a story can survive once inked onto parchment. The island also seeped into private life, into courtyards and villas, into the quiet places where Romans rested after long days of labour or leisure. Imagine a mosaicist laying tiles across a bathhouse floor, slipping one small spark of red into an otherwise calm sea of blue, a private wink at the night the waves refuse to explain themselves. Or picture mothers tucking children into bed, whispering lullabies that end with sleep now the island is far away. For children, the words meant comfort that the monsters of the horizon would not come tonight. For adults, the words carried a sting. If the island is always far away, does that mean it is real, waiting, or forever imagined? The scribes kept busy as well, their quills scratching across parchment, their wax tablets softening under thumbs. They copied itineraries that linked town to town, road to road, milestone to milestone. But when they reached the Atlantic's edge, when the map fell beyond the Pillars of Hercules, their hands hesitated. There, in that blank expanse, the Phantom Island demanded its place. To erase it would be cowardice. To draw it boldly would be arrogance. So the scribes did what scribes always do when truth is slippery, they left it vague. A dotted outline here, a phrase there, said to exist. Reported by mariners. Seen at dusk. Each word both confessed ignorance and preserved belief. One quirky tale that slips through time tells of a clerk who invented a ritual for nervous captains. Before sailing west, he would instruct them to toss a slice of bread into the water. If the bread floated westward, the island welcomed them. If gulls swooped down and snatched it, the gods wanted them to stay home. No one admitted to believing this ritual, yet captains performed it anyway. After all, bread was cheap and reassurance, however silly, was priceless. The ritual became a kind of joke and prayer wrapped into one as Roman, as debating politics while drinking watered wine. Generals, senators and scholars all found use for the Phantom Island, but it was the common folk who gave it life. Sailors told stories for free drinks. Merchants attached its name to olive jars and amphorae. Children asked about it at bedtime, and grandfathers leaned on canes and whispered half-truths as if they were sacred secrets. Every retelling polished the island a little brighter so that even its absence glowed like presence. Rome did not need the island to be real. It needed the island to be useful, and mystery is often the most useful thing of all. Picture the evening in the Forum, torches flaring, voices echoing against marble, and somewhere among the debates about taxes and temples a passing whisper, and what of the Phantom Isle? The question is rhetorical. A spark tossed into the air, a reminder that not everything in Rome's vast dominion can be measured, taxed, or conquered. It is a reminder that the horizon still has the power to embarrass even emperors. And so Section 6 draws itself like a map, half finished with ink that insists and erases at the same time. The Phantom Island remains in the margins, a rumour inked by quills, defended by laughter, preserved by habit. It exists not because anyone sets foot on its soil, but because to stop speaking of it would feel like betrayal, like losing a thread in the tapestry of empire. And if there is one thing Rome cannot abide, it is a story that dares to slip away. The rumour that once clings to keys and wax tablets begins to wander Athens in sandals of comedy and philosophy, and it does not hurry. By late afternoon, as lyres tinkle and oil lamps warm the edges of painted walls, the tale of a vanishing shore slips into poetry. Readings, dinner arguments, and those courtyard lessons where students pretend they are not drifting off. A bright-eyed youth swears he saw a dark ridge in the west. A teacher smiles and asks the softest question in the world, "How do you know you saw what you think you saw?" The boy hesitates because the horizon is a tricky storyteller. A friend jokes that the island probably ducked under the water to avoid paying harbour taxes. Everyone laughs because in Athens that sounds like normal policy. The stage takes it next. At the city Dionysia, where choruses stamp the dust and actors tilt painted masks toward the sun, a comic poet jabs at an admiral who promises to conquer the island as soon as it stops hiding. The crowd howls because the line fits every election promise they have ever heard. A mainstream fact steadies the joke Athenian drama does lampoon public figures and current events with cheerful precision, and Aristophanes really does throw cream pies of words at the proud. Laughter ripples, then leaves a thin strand of unease like foam that will not quite wash away. If a thing can be mocked so well, perhaps it also matters. Tragedy tries on the image with solemn hands. A poet compares the phantom coast to a veiled bride, present yet unreachable, a symbol for honour that people chase and do not hold. In a lively symposium, one wine-bright guest declares that the place is the true home of the muses. Inspiration appears, dazzles, and vanishes a shoreline made of song. It is a quirky tidbit, more sparkle than anchor, but somebody scratches the phrase into a margin, and the idea toddles forward for centuries like a child who will not go to bed. Philosophers worry at the rumour the way fingers roll a bead. Plato loves a grand thought experiment almost as much as straight angles, and in a different dialogue, he spins another impossible island, the one named for Atlantis, described with confidence, but verified by exactly no one. Students argue in shaded colonnades about distant lands beyond the Pillars of Heracles, asking whether such places are moral parables or tidal facts. Historians still argue whether the Phantom Island fertilises those reflections or merely floats as cultural weather nearby, but either way it turns into a classroom instrument, a bell that calls the city to wonder and doubt. Scribes keep up their careful choreography. They will not erase the crescent they inherited because erasure tastes like admitting that earlier hands mistook rumour for shoreline. Instead, they ghost it in dotted ink and cautious captions seen by some reported at dusk, placed without certainty. Copying rooms smell of smoke and glue. A clerk yawns, hesitates at the western edge, and draws the little curve again because maps dislike blankness. If a student asks why it remains, the teacher shrugs a learned shrug, and says that knowledge grows along borders, and borders deserve a pencil line. Markets make the story practical. Merchants lean over amphorae and say a rival has a wheat contract with a wind. A ship owner promises timber from the island you cannot quite miss, and collects deposits anyway. A fishmonger swears his cousin saw dogs on its beach, which suspiciously resembles what later writers say about the Canary Islands, and boys at the back start barking to lend credibility. A mainstream fact sets a keel under the chatter. Greek mariners do push beyond the familiar coasting along the Atlantic side of Iberia, reading swells and birds and colour changes as if the sea is a scroll and the waves write in blue. Spart listens and snorts. A laconic commander tells recruits to train on ground they can kick. The line earns nods and very small smiles, yet even they borrow the image. A stern teacher warns that laziness is like that island always nearly there and never underfoot. On a different hill, a priestess whispers that hope lives where maps end, which is also excellent salesmanship for temple souvenirs. A fringe quirk says a philosopher ties a ribbon to his door each time a new sighting is reported. When the ribbons tangle like grapevines, he announces a lecture and sells it out. Theatres keep finding new angles. One spring a chorus enters dressed as gulls and sings that they have rented the island to a poet for the summer. Another year, a tragic heroine begs a god to carry her, where the sea lifts a promise and lowers it again. The line earns applause because every heart recognises the trick of expectation. Between acts, vendors hawk honey cakes shaped like small crescents of land. Children lick the icing first, which is both on brand and very sticky, and an exhausted usher mutters that if the island ever appears, it will demand a cleaning fee. Back in the schools, geometry masters draw a long straight horizon and show how wet air can bend light into false capes. A tutor sketches a triangle and labels one side wish one side fog and the base land, and warns pupils to beware of adding the first two and calling the sum the third. Yet even the tutors admit a hard truth that does not fit neatly on a slate. The Aegean teaches confidence, the Atlantic teaches humility. The phantom shore becomes the proverb teachers reach for when students leap from rumour to certainty like goats on a cliff. Libraries preserve contradictions with the care of gardeners. On one roll, a calm hand notes a distance in stades, perhaps 600 stades, about 111 kilometres, about 69 miles from a cape in Iberia to a dark land seen at sunset. On another, a different hand crosses the line with the comment clouds. A third adds leave it because clouds sometimes have rocks. Margins become a tug of war in which ink plays judge and jester at once. Sailors return when the wind pays them carrying briny gifts for storytellers. A feather with a pattern no one recognises. A seed that looks like a bead. A pebble too black to be local. Do these prove anything? Not really, but they feed the tale. A boatswain claims he can smell pine resin 24 kilometres off. The captain says that is only the pitch bubbling on the seams. The crew votes for pine because it tastes better in memory. A light joke walks into a tavern anyway. The sign outside promises wine from the Phantom Island pay today drink when it appears. The line is long. Politicians discover the metaphor and polish it until it gleams. An orator jabs at a rival and says his promises are islands visible only in mist. The rival replies that they will sail when the weather clears, which is not an answer, but sounds like one and earns applause. In the assembly, a careful statesman argues that leaving the dotted crescent on official charts costs nothing but might one day save a voyage. A gruffer voice snorts that ink is cheap and rescue is not. The clerk recording votes doodles a tiny wave and decides the sea has better posture than most men. By twilight, the island works quietly on everyone. A potter paints a barely visible coastline along the rim of a cup because he enjoys secrets. A mother hushes a child with the promise that a brave island waits for a brave morning, and the child not brave at all sleeps anyway. Inland, a shepherd tells his friend that the horizon sometimes lifts like a rib cage, and that he believes the sea has lungs. The friend says he needs less wine and more water, then watches the west with him in case lungs are real. The stickiness of the tale is not certainty but usefulness. The phantom coast is a mirror. Philosophers polish it into questions. Dramatists polish it into laughter. Merchants polish it into invoices. Admirals polish it into plans. Parents polish it into lullabies. Historians still argue whether the Greeks saw a real land that later sank, or whether cloud and distance and desire performed a play together and were given a name. Either way, by now the island holds a chair at the feast. No one has walked its beaches, yet everyone knows exactly how the sand will feel underfoot. The map is not larger, but the mind is, and that is the empire the rumour conquers with perfect ease. They say the sea does not forget, but it is equally true that the sea does not explain. Sailors who chase the Phantom Island westward return with more questions than answers, their minds swimming with sights, smells, and half-memories that refuse to settle. Some insist they glimpse a solid outline, a dark ridge with a smudge of green rising above white foam, before a storm sweeps in and erases it. Others swear the island changes shape, swelling like a living creature one moment, and fading the next as if the horizon breathes and their eyes breathe with it. These fragments carried back to harbours and taverns take on a new life. Men who have never left the coves of Attica become experts on a land they have never touched because second-hand mystery spreads faster than first-hand knowledge, and it also pairs well with a cheap cup of wine. One mainstream fact steadies this swirl of imagination. Greek seafaring depends on attention, not instruments. Without compasses, they read the flight of birds, the direction of swells, the hue of the water, and even the smell of the air. That training means their senses often register something real, an upwelling current, a storm front, or a tongue of volcanic smoke, even if the conclusion leans toward theatre. When a captain claims he smells pine resin far from shore, he may catch pitch drifting from another ship, or sap from a raft of storm-tossed timber. He tells the story in Piraeus, and the audience hears a forested island whispering from beyond the pillars. No one rushes to correct a good story, especially when the storyteller has a charming scar and a louder voice than the gulls. Quirky tidbits wrap themselves around these accounts like ivy around columns. A fisherman in Rhodes swears the Phantom Island is full of goats that bleat in time with the tides. A satirist in Corinth jokes that tax collectors hid the island so they could store unpaid levies out of reach. A priest from Massalia claims dolphins guide lucky ships toward a beach and then laugh, yes laugh, when the land dissolves into mist. Were these born as jokes or warnings? After the third retelling, nobody remembers, but everybody nods as if they were there. Historians still argue whether this variety suggests there once was a real island, perhaps a volcanic cone that showed itself for a season, or whether the stories evolve like layers of paint on a wall, each coat brightening the last until the brick underneath is only a rumour. The debate is sharpened by the human need for closure. People want an answer. Either it existed or it did not. Ambiguity rubs the mind like sand under a sandal strap. Imagination provides relief, and suddenly a fog bank becomes a coastline with cliffs and sweet water and convenient shade. In the Agora at Athens, where Olive's pottery and opinions all change hands at a brisk rate, a sailor stands on a crate and paints the island with his voice. He says moonlight touches a line of black cliffs, and that birds lift from the sea in clouds as if a hidden grove shakes them loose. He says he hears frogs at a distance that should only carry thunder. He mimes rowing toward the shape and feeling the swell change under the keel, a sign of shoaling water. Children lean forward, figs in sticky fists. Philosophers stroke beards and murmur about perception, and merchants begin the sacred act of calculating profits. The story is half performance, half confession, and entirely entertainment. Doubters still carry away a seed of wonder, because it costs nothing to plant. The island also slides into private rooms. In a villa outside Corinth, oil lamps tremble. Guests recline on couches, sip diluted wine, and play that favourite Greek game of skepticism with an open door. One guest repeats a rumour that the island appears only when the moon is full, and a wind from the north is gentle. Another says it shows itself only to the pure of heart. Laughter moves around the room, but it is not a hard laughter. No one wants to anger a god with too much certainty. The host brings out honey cakes and says with the diplomacy of a man who loans money that prudence is a virtue and curiosity is another one. Both are invited to dinner. Even shipyards hum with the same curiosity. Carpenters rhythmically drive pegs and mutter that a new run west should bring an extra barrel of fresh water, because an island can hide just beyond the last barrel. A helmsman ties a small charm to the tiller, a sliver of cedar that he says points toward land when the gods are generous. He admits it points towards supper when the gods are not. Jokes like that survive storms better than sails do. A mapmaker in Massalia listens to these reports while his apprentice grinds ink. He draws the coast of Iberia with clean, confident lines, and then hesitates at the blankness beyond. Here the ink grows lighter. He adds a faint crescent and a dotted note. Said to exist. Reported by mariners at dusk. The apprentice asks if they should erase it. The master says a dotted line harms no one and helps the imagination. He keeps his tone dry, but his hand is gentle when he sets the pen down, as if he has just fed a very small creature that might someday matter. On quays from Gades to Syracuse, sailors swap a set of rules for finding what refuses to be found. Follow seaweed strands that drift not east but west. Count birds that fly at dawn and double them if a front approaches, because birds cheat and ride the wind. If 3 arrive, land may be near. If 7 arrive, the cook should start a good stew. A practical tip slides in among the rituals. A ship on a fair wind can cover roughly 150 to 200 kilometres in a day, which is about 90 to 120 miles. A fog that holds for only a morning can still shove a vessel tens of kilometres off course, which is tens of miles, which is far enough to move an island from where you swear it was to where it never will be again. Out at sea, the island grows personality because storms grow personality. Sailors say the waves slap the hull in a rhythm that mocks oars, and that lightning draws semicircles as if drawing a border. They pass a flask and decide that the sea is displeased with people who ask too many questions. The oldest hand on board offers the gentle wisdom of survival. The sea is not displeased. The sea is busy. This earns a small laugh, which earns a small easing of shoulders, which earns another hour of patience, which sometimes makes the difference between a safe return and a name on a shrine. Back on land, poets borrow the island for their own cargoes. A dramatist writes a line comparing unfaithful lovers to a shore that appears at twilight and denies itself by dawn. A comic poet stages a chorus of fishermen who try to sell invisible fish from an invisible beach, which is a thinly veiled joke about politicians. The audience roars because laughter tastes better than anxiety. Still after the play, more than one spectator drifts to the seawall and looks west with a face that is not laughing. Priests fold the rumour into ritual. At a small seaside shrine, they pour a libation to Poseidon, and ask that honest sailors see honest land. They also ask that liars learn to enjoy long walks on very dry docks. Offerings pile up shells and small coins and a carved dolphin. A mother brings her child and tells him that the island visits the brave and hides from the greedy. He believes her. He also asks for honey bread, which proves that philosophy and appetite are very old friends. Another mainstream fact anchors the mood. Greek colonies dot the Mediterranean like stitched buttons, and trade routes reach out toward the Atlantic. Mariners know the Canary Current, even if they do not name it, and they know that fogs beyond the strait can behave like walls. It is reasonable that sailors mistake cloud mountains for land when tired eyes crave edges, and the brain obliges with helpful lines. Reason does not cancel wonder. It hums underneath it. So the legend gains clarity each time proof fails. Absence becomes evidence by a strange but familiar trick. If the island were false, why do storms gather there? If the island were false, why do birds arrive in bursts? If the island were false, why does the heart lift when the horizon lifts? Logic wears a very loose chiton on the keys. That does not make the feeling less real. It only makes the tale easier to carry from mouth to mouth. And in this way, the Phantom Island grows more vivid the less it is seen. It passes from navigation into conversation, from charts into gestures, from rumour into ritual. Some say it warns against pride, others say it promises reward to courage. A few with a smile say it exists for the oldest reason of all, because a good story prefers a coastline that never quite holds still. The island thus becomes unforgettable precisely because it cannot be held a soft edge on the map of the mind, that keeps every gaze a little hungry for the west. By the 3rd century, the Phantom Island has matured from a sailor's jest into a shared inheritance. The Greeks, who are skilled at building myths out of loose stones of rumour, treat it like one more foundation for storytelling. Children in Aegean fishing villages grow up hearing about a place where trees drop fruit into the sea and dolphins leap onto beaches to deliver fresh fish. Adults smile at such tales, but they smile the way one does at an oracle's words, amused on the surface, unsettled underneath. Because if the island is false, then why does it persist? And if it is real, what kind of force keeps it forever hidden? Mainstream fact steadies the whisper. Greek knowledge of the ocean does not end with Homer's epics. Hellenistic astronomers calculate latitude sailors from Massalia, press beyond Iberia, and geographers map the Black Sea with patience. Yet west of Gibraltar the pattern frays. Fog currents and storms conspire to undo even the best calculations. Ships that hug the Mediterranean's tame coasts learn humility when faced with an Atlantic that swallows markers and laughs. In this vulnerable space, the Phantom Island thrives. It is not a rival to Athens or Sparta, but to certainty itself. One quirky anecdote comes from a comic poet who wrote of merchants docking with amphorae full of seawater, swearing it was wine from the Phantom Island's vineyards. The audience, half drunk, already roared with laughter. But beneath the joke lay recognition: when something cannot be found, someone will still try to sell it. The poet may have been mocking merchants, or he may have been mocking the audience's own hunger for mystery. Either way, the laughter lodged the island deeper into memory. Historians still argue whether the persistence of these tales points to a kernel of truth. Some suggest that volcanic islands briefly broke the surface, smoking and glowing before sinking again. Others argue the island was simply a cloud bank glimpsed again and again because human eyes crave shapes. A third school believes the island is entirely cultural, a projection of longing for something just out of reach. And perhaps the answer is all three at once. The sea has room for geology, weather and imagination together. Imagine an agora buzzing with trade. A sailor swears he heard dogs barking across open water, though no land appeared. His companion insists he saw pine trees outlined in dawn haze. A philosopher nearby strokes his beard and asks whether perception creates reality, or whether reality creates perception. The crowd groans, but some listeners lean closer because even philosophy tastes better when salted with rumour. The Phantom Island feeds everyone, sailors, philosophers and grocers, who simply like a good yarn while selling figs. Elsewhere, the tale becomes ritual. A captain about to sail west tosses a loaf of bread into the sea. If it drifts outward, he claims the island is welcoming him. If gulls snatch it, he says the gods prefer him home. It is a harmless gesture, but gestures can anchor courage more than anchors hold ships. Crews laugh, then row harder. They carry the island as a silent companion, part threat, part promise. Wealthy households decorate walls with mosaics of harbour ships, and beyond them faint pale outlines of unknown land. Guests reclining on couches trace those outlines with wine-damp fingers and debate whether their hosts believe the place exists, or whether they simply enjoy playing with mystery. In either case, the image gives the island another foothold, this time not in the sea but in art. Even generals who deal in logistics rather than poetry toy with the rumour. A fragment from a lost speech compares elusive victory to the elusive island always glimpsed, never grasped. The line lingers because it rings true. Every commander knows the chase for certainty. Every citizen knows the temptation of promises that fade when touched. By tying military ambition to maritime rumour, the island becomes a metaphor as well as a mystery. In taverns, the island becomes a scapegoat. A ship comes back late, blames storms near the Phantom Isle. A merchant's cargo rots. He swears he had to wait near the phantom shore until safe passage cleared. A soldier deserts, rumour says he went in search of the island's promised safety. One dry chronicler writes that the Phantom Island's greatest export was excuses. It is a cruel remark, but a clever one, and it ensures the story survives yet another century. And still the island resists silence. Poets sing it as paradise merchants whisper it as prophet priests warn of its omens, sailors joke of its tricks, and children dream it as playground. It becomes all things at once: hope, fear, wealth, punishment, mirage. By becoming everything it avoids becoming nothing. That is its most enduring trick. So by night, when the sea sighs against the rocks and lamps gutter in coastal homes, the island hovers just beyond reach. It lives not in wood or stone, but in words and gestures, in laughter, and debates in bread tossed on waves and in children's wide eyes. Perhaps that is the truest land of all, a place charted not in geography, but in imagination. A place the Greeks could not conquer, but could never stop carrying. The years fold into one another like waves collapsing on a beach, and still the story of the lost island lingers never fully erased. Ancient Greek sailors may have scribbled its outline on papyrus once, but Rome, Byzantium and later chroniclers carried the rumour forward, stubbornly refusing to close the book. The island is like a guest who never arrives, yet always seems about to knock on the door. Listeners lean closer to the tale because it is unfinished, and unfinished things are harder to ignore. By the 2nd century of our era, Greek mariners are long gone, but their whispers echo in Roman copies of older maps. One chronicler writes that the island drifts just west of Iberia, a crescent shape that resembles the eyelid of a sleeping god. Another says it appears only at dusk when the sky is half ash, half gold. Historians still argue whether these descriptions are echoes of genuine sightings or the embroidered threads of sailors' imaginations. Either way, the island endures not as land but as language. It even seeps into metaphors. Orators compare false promises to voyages toward that elusive coast. Poets liken it to the horizon itself, always visible but always untouchable, and philosophers use it to illustrate the futility of chasing certainty in a world ruled by change. Quirky as it sounds, one senator is said to have wagered a fortune on whether the island would ever be found. His descendants decades later tried to collect when no one had discovered it. The Senate ruled in a flourish of dry Roman humour that an island never seen cannot be declared absent. Bureaucracy, it seems, has always been a comedian in disguise. Meanwhile, the island trickles into households and taverns. In dim-lit inns along the Appian Way, sailors swap tall tales about storms that bend like crescents around their ships. One insists he heard barking dogs across the waves, another swears he smelled pine sap drifting from nowhere. His audience laughs, but they also lean in because a good story, like a good cup of watered wine, doesn't need to be true to be worth the sip. In patrician villas, guests pause before maps etched, with that faint silhouette tracing it with fingers while asking their host whether he believes. The host, of course, only smiles because mystery sells better than certainty. The cartographers, poor souls, cannot escape the problem. Erasing the phantom coastline would look like admitting error, so the line lingers softer, fainter, hedged by scribbled notes, but always present. Said to exist, one copyist mutters in the margins. Another writes, "Reported by mariners seen at dusk." These marginalia become a ritual in themselves, a tiny hesitation of the quill, a flick of ink, and the island survives one more generation. Scholars today still puzzle over whether the persistence was pride superstition or simply clerical laziness. Perhaps it was all three. Mainstream fact intrudes gently here. The Greeks and Romans both loved grand maps, Agrippa's Orbis Terrarum displayed in marble itineraries, scratched on wax, and later the ribbon-like Peutinger map. These artifacts reveal an empire obsessed with measuring and naming the world, yet their edges always fray. Sea Beast's fog banks captions like Hic sunt dracones lurk where knowledge thins. It is precisely at these edges that the phantom island thrived, nestled between data and desire. Even ritual adapts to the rumour. A clerk supposedly invented a charm for nervous captains: toss a slice of bread into the sea before departure. If it drifts west, the island welcomes you. If gulls snatch it, the gods prefer you home for dinner. A charming gesture, perhaps ridiculous, but Rome was a city that happily read omens from bird flight entrails, and even the random noise of a sneeze in the Senate chamber. Why not bread for the waves? The appetite for the unknown grows because people cannot resist unfinished stories. In courtyards, grandfathers tell children that the island appears only to the brave and hides from the greedy. In bathhouses, mosaicists slip one red tessera into a field of blue, a secret wink toward mystery. In taverns, old boatswains swear they smelled wet earth far out at sea. Jokes sprout alongside that the island's governor is a fog bank with lifetime tenure, that its main export is excuses, and that Rome would tax it heavily if anyone could ever pin it down. Power, too, finds its use. Politicians gesture toward the Phantom Isle as proof of ambition. We seek the island as we seek prosperity. Defeated admirals excuse their failures by claiming weather manifestly divine, a bureaucratic phrase meaning Neptune himself turned them back. The Phantom Island becomes a rhetorical harbour sheltering pride from exposure. Yet in its stubborn refusal to appear, it also humbles Rome, reminding even the proudest consul that the world still belongs to forces beyond parchment and decree. And finally, there is the private map each person carries. Sailors stand a little longer at railings. Generals pause at dusk, staring west with plans momentarily loosened. Librarians keep duplicate copies of scrolls in different rooms, fearful that absence can spread like fire. Parents hush children with warnings that some stories exist only to remain unfinished. In this way, the Phantom Island drifts from the sea into the psyche, reshaping behaviour more than any visible land ever could. Historians still argue whether a volcanic island once rose west of the Canaries and sank again, whether exhausted sailors mistook fog and pumice for cliffs and forests, or whether longing itself drew the line. The arguments blur into each other like waves, intertied, none-conclusive, all-compelling. That ambiguity is precisely why the legend persists. It is too useful to contradict, too delicious to discard. And so the island lingers, too polite to prove itself, too stubborn to vanish. It asks only for a dot of ink and gives in return a service only mystery can provide. It keeps imaginations restless, it humbles power, and it reminds each listener that some stories are valuable, not because they end, but because they don't. Rome falls silent at night, sandals clicking on stone lamps glowing faintly in courtyards, and somewhere someone still glances west, wondering if a forgotten shore is waiting just beyond reach. And now let the story soften the way twilight settles gently over stone streets. The Phantom Island, after so many twists and embellishments, takes a final step backward, not with anger or denial, but with the grace of a good tale that knows when to rest. It withdraws from coastline into silhouette, from silhouette into mist, from mist into the tender hush of memory. The sea grows calm in your mind's eye, its long-backed swells smoothing into silk. Ships that once strained against storms now lie still, their sails furled, their hulls rocking as lightly as leaves. Along the quays, the chatter of sailors and merchants has faded into soft murmurs, then into silence. Even the gulls seem unhurried, their wings folding into the rhythm of sleep. Breathe slowly the way the tide breathes long in, longer out. Let each thought drift past like a cork on still water. If an old question rises, you may let it pass like a dark cloud moving over the horizon. The mystery will wait. It does not demand answers tonight. Somewhere a map rolls itself closed. Somewhere a quill dries. Somewhere a captain older now smiles at the memory of chasing shadows and allows himself to be small. Above it all, the stars stand patient and unblinking, generous guardians of the night. Their silence is not emptiness, but reassurance, a reminder that you are watched over, steady and safe. Close your eyes and let that patience be yours. The Phantom Island keeps your secrets, asks nothing in return, and promises only rest. The story is complete enough, gentle enough for tonight. Let your mind drift with the tide lighter slower until dreams come to meet you.